one thing we always have to consider is that as years go on, like obviously costs do always go up in terms of like silage and concentrates, but they always go up more than what grass does. So as years go on, grass will just become more and more competitive, far more cheaper than what the other feed resources are, because cost of grass will always rise a lot slower than the other feeds. Having the right grazing infrastructure and investing in that now when you can is critical for future-proofing your farm.
Today I'm speaking with Peter Doyle, Grassland Researcher in Teagasc Grange, who looks after the Grange Feed Costing Model. This model quantifies the impacts of management, biological and market factors on the production costs of ruminant feeds. With the war in Iran increasing fuel and fertiliser costs, Peter is going to talk through the impact this will have on growing grass silage, maize and beet. As with any model, assumptions are used, so I started by asking Peter to explain those assumptions.
The assumptions we used for 2025, the average land rental price was €300 an acre. So we have a land charge in the cost of the model, whether you own the land or are renting the land. We assume there is a land charge there. The price of fertilisers from merchants based off March and April averages. Now, I acknowledge some lads bought silage fertiliser before that. So we protected urine at €740 a tonne and 18612 in at €600 a tonne. And then our contractor prices, they're based off the FCI report from Farm Contractors Ireland. That was based on their last report, which was in February 26. So I do acknowledge that them prices may be due an update or may change. But for the moment, we have the spreading in at €55 a tonne. Slurries at €100 an hour. The pit silage is €210 an acre. Mown is 33 an acre. A bale and wrap, including plastic, is €20 a bale. Maize silage is €232 an acre, and the beet harvesting is €198 an acre. And all of those prices are including VAT for the contractor.
And I suppose, Peter, just explain where the land rental price comes, because some people will be saying, oh, that's too low. Other people will be saying, God, that's mad. Where did you get that figure from?
That's from the SCSI report, which is also done in conjunction with Teagasc. Now, it was a little bit more expensive down in Munster for land, but on average across the country, it averaged €300 an acre. That's kind of like the grazed and meadow silage ground.
Yeah, okay. So I suppose it's important for people to note as well, while land rental costs have been increasing in the last few years, some of that land or the information that will flow into generating that figure will be existing land lease charges plus new land lease charges. So that's why it doesn't jump up to the big numbers that you often hear or you see in the front page of the journal or whatever. Like,
yeah.
Okay, so Peter, I suppose we might start with the grass, I suppose, Peter, just to get the relative cost of it. Like, I suppose, look, it's what you're swinging off of in terms of the actual cost of everything else. So you're looking at the grazed grass clover relative to that, zero grazing relative to that, pit silage relative to that. So what is grass costing people now in 2026, we'll say?
Yeah, so I suppose, look, at the cost of grazed grass has gone up a small bit with the increase in fertiliser prices, but it's not going to jump massively because it's fairly insulated from the contracting charges. There's not a huge amount of contracting charges that associate with grass besides like reseeding and spreading fertiliser. But with grazed grass, it's costing 14 cents per kilo of dry matter, including your land charge. So I suppose I mean to put that in costs per cow basis, if a cow is eating 18 kilos of grass, the utilised charge of 14 cents would equate to €2.50 per day to feed that cow. Now, if you didn't want to include your land charge, it's 7 cents per kilo dry matter, so that would be €1.25 per day per cow to feed her. And obviously, look at it, that's in a high fertilised system with 225 kilos of nitrogen. But if you're to have a grass white clover system or at a reduced fertiliser rate, it's about 36 cents per day cheaper to feed her the white clover than the grazed grass. So it's 14 cents for grazed grass and 12 cents per kilo dry matter for grass white clover.
And that's purely on a cost basis then, Peter will say. It's not accounting for the grass white clover giving you any extra benefit in terms of performance or anything like that.
No, just pure cost, Stuart, yeah. And then look, we did also look at zero grazing, and now obviously zero grazing would normally happen maybe more so in the spring and autumn time of the year, but we just had, for the purpose of the costing of the model, we put in zero grazing for the whole year round, and that's costing up at 29 cents per kilo dry matter. So it'd be double the cost of the grazed grass.
And effectively, that's your. Oh yeah, it's actually not that. I thought it would nearly be worse, to be honest, Peter, because of the machinery, as you said at the start there. That it's. I would have thought the machinery element of it would have increased the cost a little bit more, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. So I think we have it in at close to €100 a load for the zero grazing, but obviously based on FCI, but obviously that'll change depending on the distance from the field to the yard. Like it'll change substantially across different places.
Yeah, okay. So I suppose just on the land charge piece, Peter, just before you do go on to the silage and so forth, just
Yeah.
explain that, I suppose. Like, I mean, people will be saying, oh, I own my own land maybe in some cases, so like it's actually only costing me 7 cents a kilo, but like there is the opportunity cost of you could actually decide to lease out that land, isn't it?
The model does account for kind of your cash cost, which would be excluding your land charge, but also accounts for the opportunity cost that you could have had that land rented out. So really, it is good practice, I suppose, to put a value on your land. So that's why. And also, look, it's safe to say when it comes to silage ground too, there's a lot of people do be renting ground and leasing ground for that. So it's important to consider the land charge for that purpose also.
Yeah, and I suppose it just equalises everything really by having the land charging across whether your figure is right or wrong, I suppose is the
Yeah.
argument after that then. So just moving on to the silage piece then, so Peter, like I mean, so we were talking about it amongst our own team there and the specialists, and like the concern it would be that we're going to see an attempt to put a lot of silage into the yard in the first cut in order to get good value from that contracting charge. And I suppose it's the rationale behind that then, Peter, is what we want you to kind of strip out a little bit. Like, so you've looked at a couple of scenarios here, whether and how the concept or what you do impacts on the actual amount of material that you'll have and the quality of that material and the cost of the material. So I suppose what's the true cost of silage then?
Yeah, no. So it's certainly a question everyone's asking. All right, Stuart. Like, do we go for quantity or quality this year? With the rising costs, and really look, the story hasn't changed a whole lot from previous years. So when we're looking at the cost of the silage, we want to consider both the yield of the silage, the quality of that silage in terms of the energy, the UFL of it. So UFL would be energy, and I suppose the utilization of that. So you'll have different utilizations for bales versus pits, etc. And then obviously the total cost of the contractor and fertiliser per hectare. So all in all, we like to talk about the cost of silage, say per the energy utilised in the system. So look, quantity or quality for first cut. Really, I suppose when you talk about first cut, you really also have to take into consideration the second cut. It's safe to say most people do a second cut. Where second cuts are not done, you can often run into a fodder crisis. So we have to consider the two yields together. Obviously, as you delay your first cut, you're going to increase the yield of that first cut. However, increasing the yield and the cutting date of the first cut will inevitably end up leading to a lower yield for your second cut. And you're also getting lower energy being removed from that field when you're delaying your first cut date. So when you look at the total yield of a two cut system and take into account the energy value of that yield as well, you're going to get a higher energy yield from, say, cutting silage, say, around the 25th of May compared to cutting it like on the 12th of June. And now that's assuming that we would have grazed the land in springtime. And I'm talking about the cutting dates. The 25th of May would be good quality silage, 75% DMD because it was already, say, grazed in spring.
Okay. We'll say, would it be fair where land has been grazed very late? Some people tend to have, from the dairy perspective anyway, they might have young yearling heifers or whatever out in outside ground, maybe right up to Christmas. Is that nearly the same thing as the spring grazing, in that they're barren enough fields in terms of until they get slurry maybe in the springtime?
You might need to go a little bit earlier than the 25th of May for those. If they're grazed up until Christmas, a small bit earlier. Obviously, if they weren't grazed since last October, you'd want to be going 2 to 3 weeks earlier. Yeah, yeah, it should be done by now for sure. Um, look, I suppose you have to consider then we have the same cost, so we're getting the contractor in twice, for that two cut system. So it's certainly going to end up being cheaper where you go for your quality for your first cut, over quantity for your first cut, because when you look at the two cut yields combined, your yield and your energy is higher for your earlier cut system in the two cut system. So your costs are it's definitely more better to go for the early cut, the quality over the quantity.
So really, in reality, the contractors want to appreciate us saying this. Like as soon as the weather picks up there, and we're hoping it'll be picking up next week. Everybody should be striking to, unless they've grazed some of their silage ground very late. And we're talking, or maybe even grazed it a second time, maybe for second rotation due to being under pressure for grass if it was on the platform.
Yeah,
There may be an excuse as such to push it a little bit later in that scenario, but otherwise the vast majority of silage should really be cut before the 1st of June, really, should it?
absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Like you have to remember, like your first cut is really the only time where you can get quality and a bit of quantity along with it. Like you can easily get over 5 tons of dry matter per hectare and still achieve 75% DMD. You can't get that yield or that quality in second cut or third cut. Like so, it's your best chance of the year to get good quality silage, but also get a bit of quantity with it when you're cutting it there to the between the middle and the end of May.
And Peter, I suppose just before we started, you were saying as well about the idea that first cut should be the silage for the milking cow, effectively.
Yeah,
Is there an element as well of some people run into trouble with milk fevers and stuff like that? Like first cut obviously is cut very quickly after slurry is applied and fertiliser is applied and so forth, and there can be rapid enough growth, although people mightn't be thinking that at the minute. There can be rapid enough growth at this stage of the year, which might mean that some of that cake can come back in, but like that silage being fed to a milking cow isn't the problem, whereas that silage being fed to a dry cow then has the risk of creating a milk fever problem, whereas you can avoid that then with that kind of less rapid growth. Kind of the slurry still goes out for the second cut, etc., or maybe a little less slurry goes out in some parts of it, but it can contribute to kind of better overall management as well. Like,
yeah, for sure. But like I mean, the main thing is always get, I suppose, you say get the nutrients out in time as well to give it time to get it uptaken. But I suppose look at it, when we go in maybe and chatting about that strategy for the second cut. Another scenario we did run where look, we have two scenarios. So for both scenarios, we assumed that we'd done a good quality first cut around the 20 to 25th of May. And then we asked the question for the second cut, do you go for quantity or quality for the second cut? So for the second cut, we have one scenario where it's done the middle of July, and the other scenario is where it's done the end of July. So then July is your quantity, and the start to middle of July is your quality. So what we're seeing is it is a little bit cheaper to delay your second cut date until towards the end of July, but that's fine if you're aiming for that 68% DMD silage for dry cows, where you can feed them and they're going to maintain their body condition score on that silage. However, if that silage was cut end of July and you wanted to feed that silage to young stock or to say lactating cows, you're going to have to introduce a lot more concentrates into that system, which is going to cost considerably more. So that's obviously going to raise your total diet costs compared to if you cut it into early to mid-July. So if you need quality for young stock or lactating cows, do an early to mid-July cut to get the quality. However, if you have all your quality made in your first cut and your fodder budget says you only need quantity for your dry cows, or then going from the middle to end of July for quantity for 68% unit silage would be the advice. So I suppose match your silage. The message hasn't changed. It's match your silage type to your stock type.
so I suppose effectively what you said there as well, now, Peter, is that you still have control. Your first cut might have gotten away from you a little bit in terms of, I know Joe talks often about trying to maybe cut a bit of it early to get that quality for milking cows and so forth. Like, but maybe if that hasn't happened, you could actually aim to get quality in the second cut by doing the same thing, but just doing it a little bit later. Like,
yeah, and look, another thing maybe some people might do is they might do for both quality and quantity for second cut, depending on how much quality silage they need left to get to fill their budget. So sometimes it's no harm to have a staggered second cut, so all your silage ground is not coming back at once onto your grazing block. So that can be an option for farmers depending on what situation they're in.
yeah, okay. So I suppose the important thing probably, Peter, is for people to establish what they do need in terms of the total quantity. And I suppose there's a rough guide.
Exactly.
between young stock in a yard and milking cows for the dairy scenario anyway, for definite, you're looking at up to nearly half the silage in the yard needing to be of quality anyway. And
Definitely.
then it's about having it where you can get at it really, like.
That's another thing. Yes, the management around. I mean, if you have your first cut and your second cut into one pit, and obviously if you have young stock in the yard and you're feeding a bad quality second cut, then young stock can't get access to that first cut until halfway through the winter. And that's not a situation that we want. That's, it's not ideal either. So, some people might have to consider to have young stock in the yard. They might need to have maybe a certain bit. The first cut might have to be in a different pit or a bit as bales or something in order to have a good access to a good quality first cut for the entire winter for certain stock categories.
Yeah, okay. So I suppose the advice basically around the silage is that, as more or less the day that this is going to be going out, people should be starting to cut the first cut, because hopefully the weather should be picking up at that stage, and if it should be, maybe it's
Yeah.
done in some cases, and then we go again, strike in really quickly to try and get some little bit of May growth into the start of the second cut, and assuming a normal year and so forth, we should be looking at taking that off then from the middle, we'll say the second, third, fourth week, depending on what you aim for the second cut. And that's important as well then, Peter, I suppose, from the point of view of, and I know it's not something you really maybe looked at in terms of the costings of it there, but like the opportunity to graze that ground and subsequently let it be away from home or whatever, but the option to reduce the stocking rate potentially on a milking platform where young stock are kept at home while silage is in the mix, and then moving them off to actually reduce the stocking rate for the dairy platform. All of those things are important as well, and it's driven by that cutting date as well. I think, like, the later you go into July or even into August, I mean, you're probably closing a door on yourself in a way.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, if you went for bad quality and you're going late cutting dates, you really have high pressure on your grazing ground there in the middle of July, where you may really run tight on grass. Like, so it can be a benefit to get some of that size ground cut early with good quality and have that back in for grazing. If look, it's all based, I suppose, on one farm's previous experience and how tight they are for ground as well in the summer part of the year.
So then I suppose maybe just looking at options, obviously some people will stop up that second cut ground again for maybe partial third cut and so forth.
Yeah,
The logic of that, I suppose, and maybe even comparing it to maize now, again, like we were saying just before we started, the likelihood of getting access to maize at this stage now is limited if you hadn't already contracted it, but there may be the odd contractor out there that might have use maize to fill a gap in a rotation or something like that. So maize, there may be some maize come on the market later in the year. Like
yeah.
the justification of maybe the two cut system or the three cut system scenario, or maybe versus maize, it's a difficult question to answer now for you. But just
Yeah,
like, do you
yeah.
try to grow your own third cut, or are you better off to set that up for grazing and then buy in a little bit of maize if you can get access to it? Kind of that scenario, maybe.
Yeah, well, I suppose if we look at the total cost of a tree cut system and the total cost of a maize system, they really do come in at a similar costings if you include the land charge for both. You're talking 30, 31 cent per kilo dry matter utilized for maize, and you're talking 32 cent per kilo dry matter for a tree cut system, and they would have a relatively similar energy value. So it's much of a muchness, Stuart, in terms of which option you go for.
But in terms of if you had stock to graze ground rather than taking the third cut, would you be better to get it nearly would be the wiser decision to actually buy the maize then in that scenario, would it?
Oh yes, well I suppose depending on what costs you're getting the maize for, and can you get access to it, and do you have the facilities for it. So when I say maize is costing say 31 cent per kilo of dry matter, utilize what that's coming to in terms of cost per acre. I think it's somewhere close to 1,400 euro per acre would come close to 32 cent kilo dry matter utilized cost.
Okay, so I suppose the last one that you looked at then is the fodder beet, and that's quite common,
Yeah,
I suppose, down around here in Moore Park. It's common enough down the East Cork side, in particular, where there's a lot of it growing, maybe around Tipperary as well in parts. It does require a setup to handle it, of course, obviously. The maize is probably a little bit more easy to slot into a system if people needed to. And at the moment, we'd be hoping that people won't need some of these alternatives necessarily, because if we get a normal year, we should have plenty of feed available, hopefully. But if people are looking at it, like, it is quite a cost-effective feed, to be fair, but it's a specialised feed, I suppose, is probably the way of describing it, really.
yeah, it is certainly specialized. So I suppose if you look at the cost per acre, fodder beet is the most expensive crop to grow. However, you're getting such a high energy yield off it that if you expressed it per energy utilized basis, it would be cheaper than maize. Now the only thing is, like, fodder beet, it is a specialized job. Like, you really have to be harvesting at the back end of the year. It can be more tricky even to get out than maize. You're generally harvesting even later than maize. Now you do have a bit more of a flexible window compared to maize and when you do pull it, but like, at the end of the day, it's not that suitable for a spring milker system, because if you pulled your fodder beet in the autumn and you're generally not feeding it to your milkers until February or March, your fodder beet can start to go off when it's just piled up in the yard under straw. And yeah, that can prove to be difficult. You also have to have very specialized equipment to be able to chop it and feed it out efficiently in a quick manner. Um, so, and look, at the end of the day, you also have to consider the costs. Um, that we're talking about 32 cent for maize and 34 cent for beet per kilo dry matter, to compare to, say, silage is a wee bit cheaper, but you also have to put an extra protein and mineral supplementations on top of those fodder beet and maize costs, because obviously to be a bit lower in protein.
It's probably important to point out that you're saying on an energy value, the beet is the cheapest crop, but like, that's it's important that people think about the energy value of the silage as well. In that, getting it right, to get the value out of the silage, actually, you need to get the energy out
You
of it as
do,
well.
you
So
do.
you need to do that early cut in
Yeah,
order to get the balance right. Like,
yeah, yeah. So look, all in all, look, I mean, going for good quality silage is generally, like, that's part of the grassland management process. You have to do it in order to manage your grass correctly. So it probably is. It's the reason it's always been the most popular system, because it's probably the most easiest, straightforward is SFO system going. And very cost effective too. But I suppose, look, one thing we always have to consider is that the more thing as years go on, like, obviously costs do always go up in terms of, like, silage and concentrates, but they always go up more than what grass does. So as years go on, grass will just become more and more competitive advantage, as in far more cheaper than what the other feed resources are, because the cost of grass will always rise a lot slower than the other feeds. So, like, having the right grazing infrastructure and investing in that now when you can is critical for future proofing your farm.
okay, that's a good point. So just the last thing I'll ask you to, because we haven't really spoken about the money, I kind of touched on them in terms of maybe balancing silage and stuff out there. The cost of the actual concentrate feed, Peter, like, just relative to the grass, just to emphasize it to people that when you press the button 4 times, it's costing you this much. When you press it 5 times, it's costing you this much. If you press it twice, it's costing you this much, type scenario relative to your grass all the time. Um,
Yes,
so, like,
yes, yeah,
again, like you've already said it, trying to maximize the amount of grazed grass that we get down the throat from your perspective for the beef stock, from our perspective from the dairy stock. Like, that's no matter what way you go about it, that is the cheapest way to feed an animal. But there are concentrates fed in these systems. What
yeah.
what way do they work out relative to the price of grass then?
So in compared to the price of grass, look, we said the price of grass is, say, 14 cent per kilo dry matter. If you look at a dairy nut, um, that's €350 a ton, which you you think would cost 35 cent per kilo, but you have to express it in dry matter terms. So when you express it in dry matter terms, €350 per ton would be €420 per ton of dry matter. So it's 42 cent per kilo dry matter for concentrates, which compares to 14 cent for grass and say about 30 cent for a two cut silage system. Now, if you were to put an energy value on that dairy nut, um, that's about 4 times more expensive than grazed grass. That's including the land charge for grazed grass too. And if you didn't have a land charge of grazed grass, it's actually sorry, it's 3 times more expensive than grazed grass. If you didn't have a land charge of grazed grass, it'd be 6 times more expensive than grazed grass per energy basis.
Does that help to emphasize the importance of the quality silage in a way as well then?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Like, I mean, look, you know better than I do, Stuart, in terms of like if your silage quality isn't right, the extra cost of those concentrates that you need to offset poor quality silage, it does become a massive cost in the system.
So effectively, Peter, with the figure that you have there, like if you have poor quality silage and you have to feed an extra 2 kilos a meal to compensate for it, and it mightn't even do enough to compensate for it at the 2 kilos, it's 80 cent extra on a dry matter basis straight away.
Exactly, yeah. That's exactly it.
I think it's interesting that you're saying that, like, no matter what way the costs change, these relativities actually nearly stay the same, don't they? Like, if anything, they're favouring the grass nearly more from what you're saying there too. Like, so that
As years
as
go
the years
on,
go
yeah.
on, yeah. So, like, it just, if it doesn't focus people on the importance of grazed grass, like, what will?
Exactly. And I suppose, look, another thing that we've done the costings on, which people can maybe relate to a bit more, is the cost of a bale of silage. And look, obviously, it'll be different on different farms depending on if you're doing contractors or doing the whole lot of it or whether you're doing some of it yourself. But when we looked at it over a 2 cut system, we had 12 bales an acre for the first cut and 9 bales an acre for the second cut. And we're applying 2,500 gallons of slurry for the first cut and 2,000 gallons for the second cut. What we're seeing is that like your fertiliser and your slurry component is costing you €10 a bale. And what we're seeing with the harvesting component, that's costing €32 a bale. That's based on the Farm Contractors Ireland reference report. So they have your bale and your wrap, including your plastic, is €20 a bale. Your transport and stack is €7 a bale, which, if you consider you've a 22-foot trailer and you're bringing 14 bales to the yard, unloading them back to the field and load them again, it's taken about an hour. So that's around €98 an hour, roughly. Your mowing is €3 a bale, your raking is €2 a bale. So that's where that €32 per bale for harvesting cost comes from. Now, I do acknowledge some people will have the equipment and machinery themselves and might claim they might be able to do it cheaper if the cost of machinery already wrote off, but you have to consider the cost of your own machinery and hours, etc. Then we have a fixed cost of a bale in at €3 per bale, which accounts for like reseeding and say facilities like a concrete slab for your bales, things like that. So all in all, it's come to about €44 per bale, excluding your land charge.
In reality, though, Peter, like, that's the cost no matter what way you look at it.
Yeah.
You don't sit up in your own tractor and do it for nothing either. Like, I mean,
I think even myself as being a farmer at home, we're all guilty of undervaluing our own labour and time sometimes.
So, I suppose there's a risk then. Like, that's a big cut of bales. Like, I mean, that's people need to think about it almost in like that's a very expensive way of making a lot of silage, isn't it? If you're to do all bales effectively, like,
so the bales can come out a little bit more expensive than say pit silage because I suppose there's so much more extra plastic in the system and the cost of plastic has obviously gone up and there's a little bit more machinery handling in that system as well. Now, one thing we do consider is that you do get a slightly better utilization, actually, believe it or not, with bales than pit, but that is accounted for in the model.
Okay. So I suppose to sum it up, so Peter, grazed grass, cheapest feed, no argument. Then, like, your quality is important from your silage point of view, and that, like, I think what did you say? Penny wise, pound foolish earlier, or something along.
Yeah. It's certainly if you went for the bulky first cut to try to save money, it's definitely a penny wise, pound poor kind of scenario because I mean you will be paying for it next winter with extra concentrate. So that's aim for your quality for your first cut. That's most important.
So going for the bulky first cut will drive up the cost of the silage and actually drive down the cost of the silage, but increase the need for the concentrate, which is more expensive again.
Yeah,
effectively.
but it also will decrease decrease your yield of your second cut as well. That bulky first cut, and that's not what we want either. So it certainly go for quality for first cut, and then for your second cut, whether you go for quality or quantities, depending on your fodder budgets for your different stock types.
Okay, so and I suppose last question then, Peter, and again it may not be fair to you, but I'm sure you'll be able to answer it anyway. Just the fact that the fertiliser prices have increased, obviously, since you got those figures at the start, as you mentioned earlier. The justification for spreading fertiliser is still there to keep driving that grazed grass component rather than looking at the concentrate, obviously. And it's just important to say that to people, because people are probably thinking, how can they save money here? Like, first, if you can get your...
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Like we had protected urea as a cost in the model at €740 per tonne, and like grazed grass is still far cheaper than concentrate. So you're talking 14 cent for grazed grass and 42 cent for kilo concentrates per kilo dry matter utilised. So, and that's adding expensive fertiliser costs. So, I mean, it's not the year to be saving on fertiliser is what I'm trying to say, Joe.
So good quality silage, keep spreading the fertiliser, and minimise the concentrate to what it's needed, rather than kind of luxurious feeding of it, I suppose, is probably the way to put it. Okay, so thanks very much, Peter, for coming on this week and explaining that to us. We'll talk to you again.
All the best, Stuart.
That's all for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to Peter Doyle for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the podcast. You can listen on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify. And for more information, go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Stuart Childs, and join us next time for your Dairy Edge.